Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Pesachim. We are up to Perek Hey Mishnah Zayin. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'elu Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana Aranbayev, and Eliyahu ben Burchai Israelov, Menuchatam Began Eden, Amen. The Mishnah begins, Yatzta Kat Rishona v'nichnesa Kat Shniya. When they finished bringing their offerings, the first group left the temple courtyard and the second group entered and made their offerings. Yatzta Shniya Nichnesa Shlishit. When the second group left, the third group entered and made their offerings. K'maaseh Rishona kach maaseh Shniya v'Shlishit. The procedure of the second and third groups was just like the procedure of the first group, which we described in yesterday's Mishnah. Now, during the service of most communal offerings, the Leviim sang passages from Tehillim. They did so while the Pesach was brought as well. Now, although each Pesach was an individual offering and not a communal one, since the Pesach offerings were brought by large crowds of Jews at the same time, they were considered as communal offerings, and the Leviim sang while they were brought. The Mishnah continues, Kar'u et ha'halel. While each group slaughtered their offerings, the Leviim recited the Halel. Im gamru shanu. If they finished Halel before the group finished slaughtering their offerings, they repeated it. Now the Rav explains when the group was a large one, its members could not all finish slaughtering their offerings during one recitation of Halel. So the Leviim would repeat it. Vim shanu shinshu. If when they finished repeating it, the group had still not finished, they recited it a third time. Although this was the law, they never actually recited it a third time, literally meaning they did not read it 3 times in all their days, because there were many Kohanim performing the service and they worked quickly. There was therefore never a reason to sing Halel a third time for any of the groups. Rabbi Yehuda says, Mimehem shel kat shlishit lo egia la'avti ki yishma Hashem. The third group never even reached the passage in the that begins, I love for Hashem hears, which is chapter 116 in Tehillim, the 5th paragraph of Halel. They would never reach it even in their first recitation, because the third group had only a few people, and they therefore finished the service quickly. Now, most people would try to be in the first or second groups in keeping with the sages' teachings of Zerizin Maktimin Mitzvot. People who are Zariz hurried to Mitzvot, as the Gemara writes on page 4 in Masechet Pesachim. Therefore, only a few people were left for the third group. And that is in a Mishnah Zayin. Mishnah Chet now continues. The Pesach offering was brought on the 14th of Nisan, Erev Pesach, even when it fell on Shabbat. The Mishnah teaches how it was brought on Shabbat. K'maaseu b'chol kach maaseu b'Shabbat. The procedure of the Pesach followed on weekdays that we described in the previous Mishnayot was also followed when Erev Pesach was on Shabbat. However, certain activities related to the Pesach that were not mentioned in the previous Mishnah were done during the week, but not on Shabbat. The Mishnah will discuss this in the next chapter. However, the Kohanim would rinse the floor of the temple court on Shabbat after they finished bringing the Pesach offerings, against the wishes of the sages who maintained that the floor should not be cleaned on Shabbat. And the commentaries explain a canal of running water flowed through the temple courtyard and exited through an opening in the wall. To clean the marble floor of the courtyard from the blood of the offerings, the Kohanim would block the opening that let out the water, causing the canal to back up and flood the floor. They would then unstop the opening and the water would flow out and carry away the blood. They would do this on Erev Pesach to wash away the accumulated blood from the many offerings that were brought that day. However, like the Mishnah writes, it was against the wishes of the sages, because the commentaries explain the rabbis prohibited washing or sweeping a floor on Shabbat out of concern that one might clean a dirt floor and in the process smooth out its uneven sections, which is biblically forbidden on Shabbat. The Kohanim nevertheless cleaned the temple floor, since as a rule, rabbinic restrictions on Shabbat activity did not apply in the temple. The sages, however, were not pleased with this, because restrictions are lifted in the temple only when necessary for the service, for the avodah. Rinsing the floor after the avodah is not necessary for the avodah and is therefore forbidden. Now, the prohibition to wash or sweep floors applied only in times and places when most people had dirt floors, and not to non-dirt floors nowadays, when most floors are covered with wood or other materials. The Biur Halacha speaks about it in chapter 337, number 2. The Mishnah now cites a dispute unrelated to Shabbat about another part of the Pesach service. Rabbi Yehuda says, after the Kohanim finished throwing the blood of all the Pesach offerings, a Kohen would fill a cup from the intermingled blood of all the offerings that had accumulated on the floor, zirako zrika achat al gabei mizbach, and throw it once on the wall of the altar. In the event that in the rush to bring the offerings, the blood of any offering had spilled and had not been thrown on the altar, in which case that offering would be invalid, since throwing the blood on the altar's wall, zrika, is an essential part of the avodah of any offering. It would now be thrown as part of this cup, which contains blood from all the offerings brought that day. Now, since blood is a liquid substance, we assume that in any area in which it's contained, it all mixes together evenly. Therefore, a cup of blood from the floor is assumed to contain at least a drop of blood from every animal whose blood spilled there. But the sages did not agree with Rabbi Yehuda, because according to the sages, this should not be done, because the intermingled blood from the floor is not fit for throwing on the altar. Now, the sages hold that the blood on the floor cannot be used to fulfill the obligation of throwing the blood for the following reason. The blood that must be thrown on the altar is the lifeblood, dama nefesh, of the animal, meaning the blood that spurts from an animal's neck as soon as it's slaughtered. Most of the lifeblood from the Pesach offerings was received in vessels and thrown on the altar, so therefore the majority of blood on the floor is blood that drained from the animal after the spurting stopped, what we call dam matamtzit. This blood is unfit for throwing on the altar. The sages therefore applied the principle of bitul berov, nullification by the majority, which states that when two substances are mixed, the majority substance cancels out the minority one. Therefore, the small amount of dama nefesh, lifeblood, on the floor is cancelled out by the larger amount of unsuitable blood, and the blood on the floor is not fit to be thrown on the altar. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda holds that the principle of nullification, bitul, does not apply to two substances that are alike, what we call min b'mino. Therefore, one type of blood cannot cancel out another type of blood. Whatever lifeblood is on the floor, therefore retains its identity and can be thrown on the altar. And this is how the Gemara explains it on page 65b in Masechet Pesachim. And that is in Abotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.